Good morning. We look today at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 19 through chapter 11, verse 16, combining yesterday's and today's readings. And Paul continues to talk about righteous living and living so that we don't cause our neighbors to stumble, living so that what we do is pleasing to God. He's been talking about, eating food sacrificed to idols. And in verse 19, he says, what do I imply then? I mean, because on Saturday, if you remember, I talked about that, the families of the priests and the people that worked in the temples of these different gods, I mean, they ate the majority of the food that was sacrificed to the idols because the idols certainly didn't need to eat it. But so Paul asks, am I implying that the food that is sacrificed to these idols has no meaning? And he says, well, no. I'm implying that a pagan sacrifice is a sacrifice to someone other than God or something other than God. I mean, a pagan idol it may not be quite the same as worshiping the devil, but it's definitely not worshiping God, is what he's saying. So he doesn't want the followers to eat of this food that has been sacrificed to these false gods, to these demonic, he calls them demon gods, and in a way they are, because they're taking away from the one true God. He says you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of the demons. You can't worship both. I mean, it goes back to, Jesus said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And Jesus wasn't the first one, I'm sure, to say that either. But we know that we need to work together. And if we, on one hand, worship demons and on the other hand, worship God, I mean, we're not doing things the right way. And sometimes there are things in our lives that we don't maybe realize are taking us away from God. And I remember I don't know if I was still in grade school or if I was middle school or what, but I remember when my sisters wanted a Ouija board, and my mom, was totally against them having a Ouija board because that was kind of the black magic. That was more the work of the devil. It wasn't God's working through the Ouija board, and like with fortune tellers and those kinds of things, they're not people of God. And that's, I mean, we saw in Acts how the woman who was had the gift of prophecy and stuff. I mean, and how they cast the demon of prophecy out of her, or this ability that way. I mean, because it was something not working for God. But he says, I don't want you to be partners with demons. You can't partake of the table of the Lord and of the demons. I read that just a second ago, but it's important for us to know and to remember that we worship God, and God only do we worship and serve. So, most of the time anyway. We all have things that we put before God different times, and no matter how great our faith in God is, we still have a tendency to put ourselves number one, and I was guilty of it as anybody. I mean, so I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. I don't want you to think that. But he asked the question: are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He is? I mean, God isn't ever going to reject us. God, I mean, He says, in the Old Testament, He says, "I'm a jealous God." Following the sins of those who hate have sinned against me to the third, to the thousandth generation. I mean, we hear that in the Old Testament, but even though this jealousy of God is that God wants us to worship only Him. He says, "I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods." I mean, He doesn't want us to put other things and other gods and other things first that way. And so it's just that reminder to be faithful to God. And then in verse 23 here in chapter 10, he says the same thing he said in chapter 6, verse 12. All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. And again, I question that all things are lawful. I mean, because we know they're not. the things that are lawful build us up, and the things that aren't lawful tear us down. And he says, don't seek your own advantage, but seek to build the others up. He says, if meat has been sold in the marketplace without raising question, well, then fine. But if it's been offered to an idol and someone offers it for a meal and they invite you for it, if it's going to cause somebody else to say, well, you're eating the food of an idol and that's not, So it's again, being conscious of our righteous living for God. That's what righteous living is living for God. And when we live for God, we are watching out for others as well, and just being aware of all of those things. In verse 31, he says, well, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do everything to the glory of God. Give no offense to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God. And then as we begin chapter 11, he says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. He isn't saying be just like me because I am me, but he says be like me because I try my best to be like Christ. And this is a good goal for each and every one of us, to be like Christ. There's a song, Lord, make me like you, please make me like you. And it is. We need to be like Jesus, and we need to model that being like Jesus to those around us. So be imitators of me, as what Paul is saying, as I am an imitator of Christ. As I put my best foot forward, as I treat other people the very best I can, as I look out for other people's interests, so that I don't be a stumbling block, just help me to be the best person I can be for God and for others. And he says to do the very same thing in yourself, to be aware of all of these things. And it doesn't do us any good to go to worship on Sunday morning and put on a good show on Sunday morning if the rest of the week, we're cutthroat, we're just nasty, mean, terrible individuals to anybody and everybody we see, taking advantage of every situation. That's not being an imitator of Christ. Being an imitator of Christ is going to worship, spending time in prayer, loving neighbor as myself. That's what Jesus says. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And what a hard thing. What a hard thing that is to do in so many ways. And then he goes on here, and we can get in a little bit of trouble, talking too much about, he says, Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of the wife, and God is the head of Christ, and any man who prophesies and all this and that. And I just have trouble saying that a man is the head of the wife. The husband has authority over the wife. It works both ways. It has to work both ways. It's a partnership. And I said it just a few days ago about that. Sometimes it feels like you give 90% and maybe your spouse is 10%, and other times it's the other way. And I was reminded of a thing I saw it again just the other day of a young person asking her parents, well, how did you ever survive and have 50 years of marriage? And the mother said, we never hated each other on the same day. There are some days you can be totally frustrated with your spouse. And remember that they can be that very tough. So I am totally frustrated with you. The shoe fits both feet, But it's in that reminding ourselves that we are partners. And he talks about that in our relationship between, husband and wife. And he talks about, he says, well, if a man prophesies with his head covered, he is doing it wrong. If a woman prophesies without her head covering, she's doing it wrong. And a man shouldn't have long hair, and a woman should have long hair, because long hair is a woman's glory. And I don't know. Some of these are archaic. They're outdated. Fashions come and fashions go, and in today's society, there are women that have their hair as short as mine, and there are men that have hair that's waist long. And Some of us may think, a little bit differently about some of those things. I mean, we may not like a woman with hair that short or a man with hair that long, but it doesn't affect their eternal being. It doesn't affect who they are and how they treat each other and how they treat you and me at all. But the very last thing we look at in today's reading, in verse 16, it says, if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do any other churches of God. I mean, we're not supposed to be trying to stir up trouble in our church and between our church members. And, we're to get along, to work together. And if you're contentious, if you're always an ornery thorn in the side of everything that's going on, if you're always the naysayer, if you're always looking at the negatives rather than having it's so much nicer to be around an optimistic person than a pessimist, to be with somebody that says, man, we got a quarter-inch of rain. Oh, we only got a quarter-inch of rain. That's a terrible example maybe, but, we need to always be able to look at the good in what's out there and to find the good in other people. And finding the good in other people, maybe sometimes hard. I'll close with this now, but, the person who is just totally corrupt and totally immoral, it was said, well, you can always use them as a bad example. Find something good that you can come out of a bad situation. And not to make light of a bad situation or a bad person, but to always look for the good, to highlight the good and to compliment the good and to work together for the good, for the glory of God.